In this video, we're going to be talking about the word stressed, a word that's overly stressed in the modern world. I'm stressed, you're stressed, they're stressed out. We're going to look to identify the difference between what we could call intrinsic stress and extrinsic stress. By identifying the differences between the two and then looking at the etymology of the word, we're going to hopefully change our relationship to a word that's overly used in the modern world in comparison to perhaps how it would have been used many years ago. It's safe to say that all of us as individuals are going to have our own tolerance and threshold for what we would call stress. Everyone's going to find a different way of managing and coping with this stimulus that's coming in. For example, someone may get stressed out at the idea that Starbucks has run out of soy milk, that the Wi-Fi connectivity is low, or Trump's going to run for office again. When you hear the word stress, you automatically neuroassociate to the modern usage of the word, describing the emotional strain or tension that's placed upon our physiological and psychological processes and functions. But there's also another usage, which is talking about the material aspect and function of stress. If I'm taking this object and applying tension and pressure on either ends, then stress is created in the middle of that pen. But because we neuroassociate to stress mainly being that emotional state, we oftentimes relate to it in a completely different way to the way that may be advantageous for us to survive this modern society. So when we're talking about external stress, we're talking about that stimulus that questions our ability to cope and process this stimulus, because that's all that stress is in essence. It's a stimulus that is asking a particular process within our body, whether it's psychological, whether it's physiological, to either adapt, to overcome, or to change, or even just to move. But we know when we're talking about extrinsic stress, we're really talking about those things that we're not in control of, that surmountable pressure that builds up. You can see this in the form of maybe loss or bereavement or illness related stress that comes around until we almost feel overwhelmed or unable to cope. And this extrinsic stress is a bit more difficult to manage than say what the intrinsic stress is about, and that's really where the key in stress lies. And in this video we're going to place a lot of emphasis, we're going to put a lot of stress on the internal aspects of understanding what this stimuli is trying to communicate to us. When we're talking about internal stress, we're talking about how we process this stimulus from an internal point of view. So this oftentimes stress amounts for a lot of people because of their beliefs, their assumptions, their expectations, and the way in which they filter and process this information coming in. So their particular view on a subject, or their polarity, or they're polarized to a point where stressing them out doesn't become a difficult task. They're almost already triggered into that emotional strain or stress state because of what's happening internal that they're perceiving as external. Another person, probably more like myself, is going to get frustrated and stressed, stuck in traffic. I'm getting annoyed at how slow people are going in front. Who is that one individual that's holding all the traffic up? Well, in essence, that's an internal stress that I'm projecting to the external, because I'm more stressed out internally that I never left on time, and if I would have left a little bit earlier, I wouldn't be stuck in traffic. It's really important to remember what true stress is and its function from an external point of view, and what it is for us when we create it purely on an internal point of view. And you cannot change the extrinsic stress that are built up. You can have bouts of lots of pressure and tension in the form of work, in education, in relationships, etc., that feel like they are purely from the external coming in, and it's high bouts of battle time to manage the stress and not be overwhelmed and not be overcome. But the internal stress is something that we are creating on a daily basis purely by our relationship to the stimulus. So if you're always using the word "I'm stressed," this stresses me out, they stress me out, and all this kind of language, then you are giving more credence to the word of being stressed, or more credence to the word of stimulus that's coming into you. When someone decides to take on a journey to look at the stress within inside of their life, they start to realize that a lot of the pressure, both internal and external, builds mainly from the internal, from their relationship to this pressure or this tension that's being applied. People are in a constant state of stress. The physiological representation for that is that constant state of fight, flight, freeze or submit, which puts so much stress on their internal body that their body adapts in the way that they're under pressure or tension, in the way that it would need to deal with pressure or tension. The graph of the usage and the mentions of the word stress. So we're looking at like the 18th century. Look how little it's used, and we go through a couple, world wars kind of going on over here, and then kind of going into the 50s, and then we've had this kind of boom up to the mention of the word stress. Let's look at what are the average diseases and illnesses that were going on in the 18th century. Scroll through. Smallpox, Bubonic plague was not prevalent, but it was not eradicated. Syphilis, peripheral fever, malaria, typhus. I mean, when you look at all these diseases that were going on, yellow fever, oh gosh, influenza, the serious flu. This is all the 18th century, yet why was the word stressed only still probably used in a mechanical term, not in this term that we use it today? Were these people not stressed out? Were there not stress-related illnesses from this level of uncertainty? I'm sure there was, but because that word wasn't used in that context, you don't see it being almost part of the public consciousness either. Whereas nowadays we're very much aware of what stress is. We've seen it have an effect on ourselves and people around us. Therefore, it's become part of the public vernacular, the collective vernacular, and what we describe. But when you're looking through the disease and the treatments of the 18th century person, their quality of life was completely different from ours, and yet we are more stressed as a collective compared to what they are. Now, maybe if they had the word stress back then, they would have used it more, but maybe the perception, the way of life was completely different. Therefore, they was able to really differentiate internal stress from the external stress. The external stress was a part of maybe living for them, whereas internal stress was maybe kept to a minimum, because it's easy to feel grateful to have things inside your life when they're going well, when there's so much level of uncertainty. Some of us got so much level of certainty that we don't have much uncertainty. So when there's a little bit of uncertainty comes into our life, we get stressed out and we want to pull the plug. I pulled up this, which is like the most search engined illnesses or common diseases that people have obviously been curious about. The ancestors of the 18th century never had access to Google their conditions or their concerns, but in this instance, look how eradicated some of those horrendous ones were on the 18th century. But look at these new arrivals, or the bottom second and third one that come up on that search list was depression and anxiety. You could argue that stress is the father or the mother, and the children are depression and anxiety. So when we pull up the etymology of it, we've got the 13th century and the noun for hardship, adversity, force or pressure. Well, the first two obviously are clearly describing what we spoke about with the emotional state of what stress is, the stimulus and how we process the information. The second part, the latter part, is talking about the mechanical part of it again, the pressure, the tension that's placed upon a material object. Interesting, I like this part here when we look at the derivative from Latin. So we've got tight, compressed, drawn together, or drawn tight. And that's interesting because stress in a way is kind of the stimulus of almost like the environment and the pressures of the environment coming in and creating the walls closing in on people, and we're desperately trying to hold the walls from almost crushing us and becoming overwhelmed. Because in essence, that drawing tight from the external is also mirrored in the internal as well. The amount of illnesses and dis-ease that comes from stress being the major factor. So this all-encompassing term is quite good because it's saying that, pressure on a system, pressure on an organism without the adaptation, without the ability to function or to cope, does cause a disharmony or a dysfunction to some regard. So if we can learn to mitigate and remove unwanted, unnecessary stress that we are as individuals are creating ourselves, then hell, we might even look forward to the odd bit of stress, because we know that by it encouraging us to adapt and to overcome and ultimately build back into a kind of stronger version of ourselves. So we should, in essence, welcome certain stress into our life, because it's one, a sign of living. You don't get out of this life without some form of stimuli and stress. And also as a way, as an opportunity to overcome and to grow. And people that understand this will actively choose to stress themselves out. Someone who doesn't exercise finds it very strange that someone would enjoy going and stressing their body out, increasing their heart rate, because they're choosing to increase their heart rate, as opposed to the fear of their heart rate increasing in the form of anxiety and the heart racing. They're actively choosing to exercise, and that almost seems crazy to some individuals that don't work out, how they see other people and think, what, you want to make yourself tired? But those individuals realise that with that certain level of stress also comes that great training ground in order to overcome, to reframe and to change the perception of what we truly call stress. Understand, how much do I have to allow the stimulus that is coming into my body or being processed by my mind to have that much agency to call me stressed out? Because sometimes that descriptive word of being drawn tight or compressed is a great way of describing the internal conflict and pressure that a lot of us walk around with every single day, that inhibits and hinders the quality of our life, our own beliefs, our own expectations, our own assumptions. By really getting down and deep on those, we can understand that really we give permission to be stressed and to be stimulated. that fight or flight is there as a physiological response to absolute danger and high levels of stress, but a lot of the internal stress that we carry around is from minutia. And you'll stop looking from the enemy outside of you and focus more on the enemy within, and ultimately identify that stressing is really you allowing the system to be overcome. And when you say that you can't cope, is it truly that you can't cope, or have you just not found the means or the support or the guidance in order to address what you would call these stresses within inside of your life?